They thought banning a simple fishing dock would break him, but that decision lit a fuse no one in that town could ever extinguish. One woman in white clothes, gripping power like a crown, laughed as she tore down his past, but she never saw the dam behind his silence, or the storm waiting in his chest. Tonight, luxury yachts worth millions will rot in the dirt, and pride will drown louder than any flood. Before we begin this story of betrayal and revenge, make sure to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Karen stood in her flawless white suit, voice sharp enough to cut through bone as she announced that the fishing dock was banned. She said it like it was a crown jewel in her hand, like destroying his world was nothing more than an afternoon errand. Every eye turned to him, expecting rage, expecting him to snap, but he only clenched his fists behind his back and let a thin smile spread across his face. That silence burned hotter than fire, and even Karen faltered for a second. A dock was nothing compared to what she had just awakened. She smirked again, louder this time, pointing toward her fleet of yachts gleaming in the water. She bragged about them as if they were her children, mocking him, daring him to resist. His dock was illegal, she said. His dock was worthless. But her voice cracked for the briefest second, because deep down she felt something shift in the air, like she had just cursed herself. He didn't shout back. He didn't beg. He let her gloat, let her humiliation sting. Then, quietly, he whispered words no one could quite hear, but his eyes told the story. She had just declared war. The crowd murmured. Neighbors shifted, uneasy. Some pitied him, others feared what might follow, but all of them knew he wasn't a man who took insults lightly. He had built that dock with his father, wood soaked in memories, in laughter, in the echoes of simpler days. Karen hadn't just banned planks of timber. She had ripped out roots, spat on his bloodline, and she thought there would be no price. That arrogance would soon be buried beneath the weight of her own empire. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, but close enough for her to see the fire in his eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The promise was clear. What she loved most would rot, and she would watch it die. Karen laughed nervously, trying to smother her fear, her hands clutching the pearls on her neck. But deep inside, her body knew the storm was real. And storms don't ask permission. The HOA board cheered her, clapping, pretending they had won. They thought this was justice, a small-town victory over one man. But the truth was simple. They had just signed their own sentence. The silence of the man they mocked was heavier than any shout. Karen told herself he was broken. In reality, he was already building the revenge she couldn't imagine. Every second of her speech was fuel poured over a fire that would burn her kingdom to ashes. When she turned her back, he didn't follow. He stood on the edge, watching her walk away in white, as if she were untouchable. But that image was already cracked. Soon the white would be stained, not with water, but with dirt, with rage, with humiliation. Neighbors would whisper not about her power, but about her downfall. And she would know it wasn't luck or chance. It was karma, sculpted by her own cruelty. The whispers of the crowd carried, buzzing with unease. Someone muttered that he looked too calm. Someone else warned that calm men are dangerous. And still, Karen laughed, sipping champagne in her own mind, already dreaming of her next victory. She had no idea the ground beneath her empire was already shifting. The dam that fed her precious lake, the same water her yachts rested on, was a weapon sleeping in plain sight. And he was the only one who knew how to wake it. He walked away at last, slow and steady, his silence louder than her shouting. People stared, trying to guess his next move, but no one could see the vision forming behind his eyes. They would all remember this night, not as the day a dock was banned, but as the moment a woman in white laughed too loud and too long at the wrong man. His father's memory weighed heavy on his chest, and that weight became steel. What Karen destroyed, he would rebuild, but not before tearing down everything she ever thought she controlled. And as the night closed around them, Karen raised her glass in victory, completely unaware that this was the last time she would ever stand so tall. Her yachts gleamed, but their shine would not last. He whispered one final line, so low only the closest neighbor heard it, but it spread like wildfire. She thinks she won, but tomorrow her empire sinks. And just like that, the first chapter of their war was carved into stone. Karen's laughter still echoed in his head, every syllable sharper than glass. She thought the dock was gone forever, that his silence meant surrender. But while she toasted her victory in white silk, he was already moving through shadows, hunting for the one thing no one dared to touch. The dam records, buried, forgotten, locked away in a dusty cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. While the HOA slept fat and smug, he turned each brittle page like it was a weapon. And in those pages, he found the valve, the control, the weakness. Karen had yachts, but he had the river's throat in his hand. Meanwhile, the celebration grew louder across the lake. Music, champagne, glittering laughter. Karen in her flawless white outfit leaned across her yacht's rail, mocking his name, raising her glass to the crowd. She bragged that he was finished, that he would leave in shame, that her empire was untouchable. Each word carried like poison, spreading into the crowd. People nodded, afraid to disagree, but eyes betrayed doubt. Even the ones who clapped too hard couldn't shake the memory of his stare, the silence that promised something heavier than anger. Silence like that doesn't fade. It sharpens. He carried the dam's blueprint in his hand like it was his father's will. Every bolt, every rusted wheel, every forgotten chain marked on paper like coordinates on a treasure map. Only this wasn't treasure. It was vengeance written in iron and water. He remembered his father's hands, rough and steady, guiding him as a boy to cast the first line from that dock. That dock wasn't just wood. It was bloodline, history, love. Karen had ripped it out of the earth with a smile. And now she would pay with something she loved more than life itself. Her pride, her power, her floating palace. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Some pitied him, some feared him, but all of them knew something was about to happen. They just didn't know how close it already was. He traced his finger along the blueprint, whispering to himself, reminding his father that revenge wasn't rage, it was patience. Patience sharper than knives. He would wait for the moment Karen's arrogance reached its peak, and then he would shatter her world with the turn of a wheel. At the party, Karen leaned against the railing of her yacht, still in white, still drunk on her victory. Her voice cut through the night like a siren as she mocked the man she thought was gone. She raised her hand, laughing, telling the crowd she had ended a nuisance. But in the middle of her laughter, her phone buzzed. A neighbor whispered something too low for the others to hear. She froze for a moment, her smile faltering, her knuckles whitening against her champagne glass. He had been seen near the dam. Karen forced her laughter again, louder, harsher, desperate to cover the crack forming in her mask. But cracks grow. He stood at the dam's edge, staring at the massive wheels, his chest tight, his mind locked. The voices of his father and mother, the weight of humiliation, the memory of Karen's laugh, they all collided in one brutal wave. His hands shook, not with fear, but with the enormity of what he was about to do. This wasn't rebellion. This wasn't just revenge. This was rewriting the balance of power. He gripped the rusted handle, his veins alive with fire, his silence now a roar only he could hear. And as he took his first breath, the thought pierced his skull. When he turns this, everything changes. Before we go deeper, I want you to imagine yourself in his place. Would you have done it? Would you have risked everything, your freedom, your life, just to crush the arrogance of one person who humiliated you in front of the world? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because this choice is the edge between justice and destruction, and once it starts, there's no way back. He pushed the wheel, just enough to hear the first groan of metal. The sound echoed like thunder in his bones. He stopped, sweat running down his face, the silence after that groan louder than any storm. He stepped back, chest heaving, the blueprint shaking in his hands. This was no fantasy anymore. This was real. The dam wasn't just paper. It was alive, waiting, begging to be unleashed. And he was the only one holding the leash. At that same moment, Karen lifted her glass again, forcing her laughter. The crowd cheered, but her eyes flickered, darting to the dark horizon where the dam stood silent. She thought she was mocking him. She didn't realize he had already begun. He placed his hand back on the wheel, closing his eyes, and whispered to the memory of his father. For family, for dignity, for justice. Then, slowly, with a strength that came from rage buried too deep to ever rot, he began to turn. The wheel creaked louder, heavier, each rotation a nail in Karen's golden coffin. And as the first vibration shook through the dam's bones, he knew there was no return. Her yachts would not sail tomorrow. They would sink, and the world would watch her crown fall into the dirt. The first groan of the dam became a roar. Water surged, not in whispers, but in screams, ripping forward with a fury no wall could cage. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the gates cracked open, each drop turning into a tidal force. He held the wheel until his knuckles bled, until the sound of rushing chaos swallowed his heartbeat. This wasn't theory anymore. The weapon was awake, and there was no silencing it. Across the lake, panic set in like wildfire. Karen's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the deck of her yacht as she saw the rippling water drop. Her voice, once dripping with arrogance, now rose sharp with fear, barking into her phone, demanding someone stop it. But her words carried nothing now. The lake was dying beneath her, every ripple turning into retreat, dragging her empire into the dirt. Her guests stared wide-eyed, their laughter strangled into silence. Phones came out, cameras recording the fall of royalty in real time. No one rushed to help her. They wanted to watch. He tightened the wheel again, veins burning, teeth grinding, as another gate screeched open. The flood spilled like a monster unchained, devouring everything in its path. He could almost hear his father's voice, steady, telling him justice sometimes looks like destruction. He wanted Karen to feel it. Not the water, but the silence that follows when everything you flaunted turns into rubble. This was not about rage anymore. This was a lesson written in water and dirt. Karen staggered, clutching the railing, shouting at the HOA board members to fix it. They scrambled like ants, calling, pleading, running toward trucks and locks. But when they reached the dam, the locks were already sealed shut. He had planned it. He had cut every path off. The board clawed at the gates, but it was too late. His silence had outsmarted them all. Their empire was paper. His revenge was stone. One yacht tilted, the metal groaning, the people screaming as glasses, tables, and chandeliers slid into the water. Karen's scream pierced the night as her million-dollar pride sagged like a wounded beast. Another yacht leaned sideways, smashing into the next, luxury crumbling like dominoes. Guests scrambled, their designer clothes dripping, their masks of superiority torn away. Karen yelled at them to fight the water, but no one listened. They were too busy saving themselves. Her voice had ruled over them for years. Now no one cared. He stepped out onto the bridge, arms crossed over his chest, watching the empire unravel. Neighbors whispered his name from afar, phones capturing his silhouette as the man who stood against the queen. He didn't move, didn't gloat with words. His laughter came quiet, dark, cutting deeper than any shout. Karen saw him, her eyes wide, her hand trembling as she pointed toward him. In her gaze, fear and rage collided. She screamed his name, cursing him, demanding he stop. But he only tilted his head, and his smile told her what she already knew. It was over. Karen's face twisted, pale beneath her flawless white, her hands clawing at her pearls as if they could save her. She screamed for police, for lawyers, for mercy, but each word fell flat under the roar of collapsing pride. Her empire was being ripped apart, and she could do nothing but watch. Guests abandoned her. Her board members vanished. Even her closest allies pretended not to know her. The woman who silenced a town was now screaming into an abyss that didn't care. And the abyss answered only with water. One last yacht crashed violently into the dock, splintering wood and metal, sending sparks flying as lights flickered out. Karen's scream broke into sobs, her mascara running, her pearls snapping to the ground. For the first time, she wasn't the queen in white. She was just another human watching her illusions sink. And he stood above her, calm, untouchable, a shadow that didn't need to lift a hand anymore. His silence had already destroyed her crown. And yet, this wasn't the end. As the water tore away and the lake revealed its bones, something darker stirred. Karen's scream didn't stop. It hardened, twisting from panic into a vow. She clutched the railing with bloodied fingers, staring across the broken lake at the man she hated more than life. She spat words that cut through the night, words meant to outlive the wreckage. "This isn't finished. You'll pay. I'll bury you alive." His laughter cut through her vow, soft but merciless, and it was that sound, not the water, not the wreckage, that made her chest collapse. He had already won this night, but the war had only begun. Karen's voice broke first. The queen in white who banned a dock now begged for mercy with a tremor she couldn't hide, demanding the water rise, ordering the knight to obey, promising favors to anyone who could reverse the turn of a wheel. He didn't answer with a speech. He answered with a laugh that cut through her titles and reduced her crown to costume jewelry. She called his name like it was a weapon, but the moment had already turned against her. Board members drifted to the edges, avoiding her eyes. The same hands that clapped for her victory now had phones, recording the fall. He stood on the bridge, arms folded, the storm he started roaring louder than her power ever did. She tried one last order. The water ignored her. A man in a blazer stepped from the cluster of loyalists, face pale, tie crooked, eyes done with pretending. Mark, the treasurer, the one who collected fines like trophies, stopped in front of him and pressed a keycard into his palm. He said he was finished being her shield, finished watching neighbors bleed while she smiled in white. He confessed that the emergency bypass she bragged about was theater. The Real control lived in a manual pin no one had touched in years. He told him where it sat and what to do when she called the county. He moved without hesitation. Mark yanked the safety pin. Metal protested. The last gate locked in open position with a punch that echoed like a verdict. Karen lunged, fingers clawing, pearls snapping as they hit the ground. She screamed that this was theft, sabotage, treason, every word a ladder to a sky that wasn't listening. Mark didn't flinch. He said he was choosing his kids over her yachts, and for the first time in years he looked free. Karen spun to the crowd, pleading for the sheriff, for the mayor, for anyone with a badge. Two officers arrived and froze at the edge of the chaos, eyes moving from the stranded yachts to the papers in his hand. He held up the old maintenance directive he found in the dam records, signed by hands older than anyone in this crowd, authorizing emergency drawdown when structures risked failure. The ink wasn't new, but authority doesn't age when it's legal. Karen tried to laugh at it, then saw the seal and stopped laughing. The officers stepped back. Karen's board scattered. Her donors pretended to check their watches. A guest in glittering shoes asked if this counted as an act of nature. Someone else muttered that bylaws don't float. He almost smiled at that, a razor-thin line of humor in a night that had no mercy, and even that flicker hurt Karen more than words. Another yacht grounded with a teeth-grinding shriek, nose buried, engines coughing into silence. Crews panicked, ropes snapped, pride split down the middle. Karen's voice turned small as she promised rewards to anyone who could save her fleet. A teenager in a hoodie shouted that karma just clocked in. The crowd laughed, nervously first, then boldly. Power had shifted, and everyone felt the floor tilt under their feet. If this moment hits you in the chest, tap like and tell where you're watching from, because this is the second everything changed and the town finally saw the truth. Her empire wasn't defeated by fists. It fell to proof, patience, and a man who learned that silence can be more violent than rage. Karen tried a new mask, apology. She said the dock ban was misunderstood, that she cared about tradition, that she never meant harm. He answered with a question she couldn't escape. If she cared, why did she laugh when she took what wasn't hers? She had no answer. White suit, empty hands, crown gone. Mark leaned in and said the audits would ruin her before the lake finished draining. Hidden fees, double fines, kickbacks dressed as community projects. He had files, time-stamped and cold. Karen's shoulders sagged, then bristled, then squared, a storm rebuilding itself. She told him she would bury him, bury Mark, bury anyone who stood with them. She said they had no idea who stood behind her. He finally moved, a single step that felt like a door closing. He told her to pay back every dollar, and he would rebuild what she tore down. She stared at him, eyes bright with a kind of faith only the desperate keep. She said she would pay nothing and take everything that mattered to him. He smiled, not kind, not cruel, simply finished. The crowd went quiet, sensing the next hit they couldn't see yet. Night pressed closer. Phones lit faces. The officers exchanged looks and withdrew again, waiting on a call from above. Karen lifted her chin and called someone she never used in public, the number she pretended she didn't have. Her voice dropped to a whisper that still sounded like a blade. The person on the other end agreed too quickly. Across town, a lock turned at a small workshop where the lights should have been off. A can tipped. A line gleamed across the floor. A hand struck a match and watched it think. The flame considered the line and smiled back. Then it began to run. The first spark spread too fast. His brother had only stepped outside for air when he caught the glow under the door, the hiss of fire licking wood. In seconds, the workshop where they built, repaired, and survived became a furnace. He ran in shouting, pulling hoses, throwing blankets, but the flames were not an accident. The smell of fuel made it clear. This was Karen's answer to humiliation. She couldn't lift the yachts from dirt, so she tried to burn his blood instead. He arrived in time to see his brother stumble out, face covered in soot, coughing blood into the dirt. Rage and fear collided so violently inside him it felt like bone splitting. His doc was memory, his father was past, but his brother was flesh still alive, and Karen had struck at him. Neighbors poured water, dragged tools, shouted warnings, but the fire roared higher. Everything they had built was being erased in front of their eyes. The crowd whispered, some filming, some weeping, all knowing this wasn't chance. This was war. Karen stood across the road, still in white, arms folded like she had already won. She called it justice, punishment for sabotage, proof that he wasn't untouchable. Her smile widened as sparks cracked into the night sky. She asked where his silence was now, where his smirk had gone, if he could laugh while his own blood choked on smoke. She wanted the world to watch him break. She wanted witnesses when the crown came back to her head. He carried his brother in his arms, face blackened, lungs gasping. For a moment, grief nearly crushed him. For a moment, she almost succeeded. But then his brother whispered one line through cracked lips. "Don't stop." The fire behind them roared, devouring walls. But that line froze him stronger than steel. He laid his brother down with neighbors guarding him, turned toward Karen, and the silence came back, sharper than knives. She had burned the wrong man's family. The town that had been afraid now turned restless. Whispers turned to shouts. Someone cursed Karen's name. Another threw a stone near her feet. She laughed at them, but the crack in her voice betrayed fear. For years she ruled with fear. Now the fear had flipped. The man she mocked stood taller in smoke than she ever did in silk. He raised one finger at her, not shouting, not pleading, just a promise. This ends. Engagement burns hotter in moments like these. If you were here, would you fight back or walk away? Tell me in the comments what you'd do, because this is the edge between a man destroyed and a man reborn, and choices like this decide who holds power. Karen tried to rally her board, but Mark stepped forward again, holding files high. He said the audits were already moving, that her empire wasn't just sinking in the dirt, but in numbers too. Her face drained, white on white, and she screamed that he was lying. He dropped papers at her feet, invoices, fines, signatures, proof of her thefts. She stomped them into the ground, but the crowd had already seen. She was no longer a leader. She was a thief in pearls. The fire finally died to ashes, the workshop a skeleton. His brother lived, but his legacy was charred. Karen thought she had broken him by destroying what he loved. She didn't see she had only stripped away hesitation. He stood in the wreckage, shirt torn, arms streaked in ash, and swore to the crowd this was no longer about a dock, no longer about yachts. This was survival. This was justice. This was war. Karen smirked once more, trying to steady her voice, trying to reclaim her crown. She told him he would regret declaring war on her, that she had allies who wouldn't hesitate to spill blood. He didn't blink. He told her to bring them all, and he would still be standing when her world collapsed. The crowd erupted, gasps mixed with cheers, the air alive with tension. Karen's jaw clenched, but her eyes revealed it. Fear was back in her bones. As the night bled into silence, he stood over the ashes, fists clenched, gaze fixed on her. She had crossed a line, one no crown could save her from. She had taken memory, taken history, and now tried to take family. She had nothing left to lose but her life in white, and he swore he would strip it from her. The town knew it, Karen knew it, and even her allies knew it. The fire hadn't ended anything. It had only written the opening line of a blood war. And as the embers glowed, Karen whispered one last promise to herself, teeth grinding, hands shaking. If he wanted war, she would deliver it in darkness. She would not rest until his name was gone from the earth. What she didn't know was that his next move was already waiting, and it would not be fire. It would be something far darker. The drained lake lay in silence, its cracked floor littered with stranded yachts like fallen monuments. Karen arrived draped in white, her pearls catching the faint light, But there was no grace left in her walk, only venom. She hadn't come alone. Shadows followed her, mercenaries with scars on their faces and chains in their fists, men paid to erase problems instead of solving them. She raised her hand and pointed across the dirt at him, her voice trembling but defiant. Tonight, she vowed, the story ended with his blood in the dust. He stepped forward without hesitation, his brother's words still burning in his chest, the ashes of their workshop clinging to his skin like armor. He faced her without flinching, arms steady, his silence loud enough to make even mercenaries hesitate. Then he spoke, low and cutting, promising that she would see her empire break on the same ground she thought she ruled. His voice was steady, and that steadiness unnerved them more than rage ever could. The first mercenary lunged, chains snapping through the air. He dodged, fists tight, slamming the man down into the dirt where a yacht had once floated. The sound of bone against earth cracked the silence, and the crowd gasped. Another mercenary charged, but he twisted the man's own blade back into his shoulder, dropping him where he stood. Karen screamed for them to keep going, her voice shrill, desperate, but each fighter that ran at him fell harder than the last. His rage was precise, his strikes like promises delivered. This wasn't just a fight. This was years of humiliation crashing back all at once. Karen's pearl necklace snapped as she grabbed a fallen pipe herself, rushing forward in blind fury. Her white clothes, once a symbol of control, now dragged through dirt and blood. She swung wildly, screaming his name, calling him a monster. He caught the pipe, twisted it from her hands, and threw it into the dirt at her feet. She stumbled, breathless, but her eyes never stopped burning. She would rather die in rage than live in silence. One of the mercenaries broke ranks, stepping back, then further back, before dropping his weapon altogether. He shouted that Karen had lied to them, that she promised money stolen from neighbors who already had nothing. He revealed everything: how she funneled funds, how she sold favors, how she stacked her pockets while others starved. The crowd roared, voices rising with fury, neighbors pushing forward. Betrayal had cracked her shield wide open. Karen spun on him, snarling that he was a traitor, that he'd regret speaking. But no one moved to protect her. Even the mercenaries who still stood lowered their eyes. Power had abandoned her completely, and her empire was stripped bare in the dirt. She looked around, screaming at the board, at her allies, at anyone, but every face turned away. She was alone, pearls broken, hands shaking, fury dissolving into fear. He moved closer, step by step, until Karen fell back against the rusted hull of a beached yacht. He stared down at her, arms crossed, eyes cold. She spat at his feet, refusing to bow, insisting that he had ruined everything, that he would answer for it. But her words carried no weight. They fell flat in the silence of a crowd that had already judged her guilty. He said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The dirt around them spoke louder than any words. She lunged again, hands clawing at his face, her rage twisting her into something unrecognizable. He caught her wrists, slammed her down into the dirt, holding her there as she kicked and screamed. The crowd gasped at the sight, the once untouchable queen pinned beneath the man she tried to bury. Her white clothes stained with soil, her voice cracking into shrieks. She cursed his name, swore vengeance, but all anyone saw was defeat. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Every eye watched, every heart pounded, waiting for his next move. Would he enter now? Would he strike the final blow? The tension clawed at throats, dragged breaths into lungs that couldn't exhale. Even the night seemed to freeze around them. And then, with her pinned beneath him, the yachts stranded like skeletons, and the crowd holding its breath, he whispered something only she could hear. Her eyes widened, fury flickering into fear, and she shook her head violently, denying it, refusing to accept the truth. But his voice was iron, and his silence afterward was worse. The crowd leaned forward, desperate, hungry, clinging to every second. And in that silence, the war between them reached its breaking point. Everyone knew the next breath, the next heartbeat, would decide everything. The night closed in tighter, the crowd gasping, Karen thrashing, his grip unyielding. And then the air broke with one sound, a siren, sharp, piercing, rushing closer. Blue and red lights spilled across the dirt, bathing their faces in judgment. The law had arrived, and with it, The cliff between justice and destruction. The sirens painted everything red and blue, but even their cry couldn't drown out Karen's screams. She thrashed in the dirt, shouting that she was the victim, that he had stolen her crown, that he had destroyed her lake and ruined her life. Officers moved in, hands hovering, unsure where to begin. The crowd didn't flinch. They had seen too much. They knew the truth. The Queen in White was no victim. She was the storm that finally drowned in her own flood. He rose slowly, releasing her wrists, standing tall as she clawed at the dirt to crawl away. Her white clothes stained with mud, her pearls cracked and scattered, her voice breaking into desperate sobs. She turned to the crowd, begging them to speak for her, to save her. But silence met her plea. For years she silenced them. Now they returned the gift. Silence can be crueler than any blade. Mark stepped forward, holding the files high. He placed them into the hands of the officers and said loud enough for all to hear that this wasn't about a dock or yachts. This was theft, blackmail, and lies buried in numbers. He spoke of the audits, the bank accounts, the signatures, every dirty deal Karen had hidden under her smile. Her face fell, her body trembling, as the officers flipped through pages that spelled the end of her empire more brutally than any fight could. She tried to laugh, tried to pretend, but her laugh cracked into sobs. The crowd's patience snapped. Neighbors shouted that she stole their savings, their homes, their dignity. One woman screamed that her husband died paying fines Karen invented. Another man raised his arm, scars visible, saying she mocked him in public when he begged for leniency. The town's fury rose like a wave, voices crashing, years of pain spilling out all at once. Karen's hands shook as she covered her ears, but she couldn't block it. She was drowning in the echoes of every life she ruined. The officers snapped cuffs around her wrists. Pearls rattled as they clinked shut. She screamed that she would never wear chains, that she was untouchable, but the metal spoke louder. Her empire was gone. Her crown shattered in front of everyone she once ruled. She was dragged to her feet, her white suit no longer clean but torn and filthy. The crowd cheered, tears mixing with laughter, relief heavy in every voice. For the first time, justice didn't feel like a dream. It was real, breathing, undeniable. He didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He watched with a silence sharper than any sword, his arms folded, his eyes steady. Karen met his gaze one last time, her eyes wide with fury and fear, and she hissed that this wasn't over, that someone greater than her would come for him. He tilted his head, a faint smirk playing at his lips. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was just the first chapter. But tonight, she was finished. The dock returned. Neighbors worked with him, rebuilding what Karen destroyed. Wood hammered, nails driven, sweat and laughter mixed. Children cast lines where he once stood with his father, the sound of water alive again. He placed his father's old fishing rod on the railing, hands trembling as memory and closure bled into each other. His brother, scarred but breathing, stood beside him, whispering that the dock wasn't just rebuilt. It was reborn. He looked across the dirt where the yachts once floated. They sat stranded, hulking corpses of pride, monuments to arrogance. They weren't trophies anymore. They were warnings, reminders that power built on greed rots faster than wood. The crowd that once feared Karen now gathered freely, laughing, sharing, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. Her empire had collapsed, but the town had risen. If you felt this story in your chest, smash that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments if justice was finally served. Because this wasn't just revenge. This was a lesson carved into the earth, a truth too heavy to ignore. No crown survives when it rests on lies. And as he sat at the dock, the rod steady in his hand, a whisper crossed the crowd. Someone greater was coming. A bigger HOA, sharper, richer, crueler. Karen's downfall wasn't the end. It was the spark of something larger. And when that storm arrived, they all wondered if he would stand again, or if this time, the war would consume them all.